So he'll be walking around so that everybody can hear. And now comes the scary time. Are there any volunteers who would like to speak on behalf of their group?
I'll volunteer.
Thank you.
I don't want to volunteer, but I'll volunteer. First of all, let's do this again, because it helps me in framing how I see it.
Put it right up to your mouth.
Hi.
Hi.
Let's do it again. Let's do it in an informal setting, not inside a building like this. I don't know if the weather will allow us. The group was a great group. First of all, because I started off, I was taking the task for what I said. But no problem there at all. What I would love to see as an individual is a speaker's corner in Vancouver.
A speaker's what?
Speaker's corner, where you try to diffuse a little bit of the anger. But one of the people in the group said something that was interesting from my perspective. He said, silence is speech. Silence will always be speech. And it's a threat to your personal liberty. Step back a second and think about what you lose by being silent. But overall, the consensus was that we could do a better job as individuals trying to understand the other individual and not react, but at the same time, do say something if necessary. Basically, there's no, the group is saying, we don't have an answer to the questions yet. But I think the group as a whole is pretty freaking smart. and from this perspective of those that have been outside the country, they see reality maybe the way that we in the Northwest see it. That other cultures that are terribly interested in us may be fearful of us for reasons we don't even have any clue to. But the conversations we have with those outside our own borders can frame how we lead our lives.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We hear from another group. Was there a consensus developing? Or was there some serious disagreement? Were there new questions?
This would be short. We had a really good group. I think we just sort of got stuck on number one and stayed there. Went around it a few more times, but we had a lot of dialogue back and forth. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong here, our general consensus was clearly the censorship is the greater threat than anything else. And the gentleman in the front there was saying at the end, the educational portion that you guys alluded to at the beginning there is really critical, and that's going to be the defense to do that. We have to counter the hate speech with our positive speech. That's the only way we're going to counter that, because otherwise we drive it underground and then it becomes a mess.
Yes.
Thanks.
And we had two more groups, right? Brave soul. Brave soul. Thank you.
I don't know that we answered any of the questions specifically, but one of the things that we talked about was how we feel like fear is what drives this contention back and forth. And so getting to what people are fearful of, investigating that so that we can then have a good conversation.
I think.
We also talked about becoming media literate and people being concerned about the sources of where media is coming from, and so having that kind of education would make a big difference. And I think. Hello.
Hi.
We also believe that there's more people in our country and elsewhere that think we have a lot more in common than we have differences, and that the media will amplify those differences, but in reality the majority of us understand that we have a common shared experience, and we have less to be afraid of than we think.
Thank you so much.
Well done.
And that group back there, maybe?
We have more questions.
I don't think that we really felt like we resolved anything. I was just most impressed by, it's nice to be with a group of very thoughtful people wrestling with the same issue. And it did, we noted that a lot of times when some speaker or group is being opposed by another group, it gets a lot more coverage. When at times, just leaving it be, it would make much less of a splash. Anyone add anything?
Anybody else, just generally, were there some questions that are still burning for you that these topics bring up that you're still personally wrestling with, or maybe someone that you know is wrestling with? Yeah.
I just want to share with you my initial reaction to reading the second question, and that was to write a question of my own. So the second question is too much tolerance dangerous, or is giving an authority the power to restrict freedom of speech and assembly even more dangerous? And my question was, are these inverse ideas?
Any thoughts on that? Perhaps we'll just let you all have that percolate, because I certainly don't feel like an expert. Like I said earlier, we're not here to be experts. We're here to facilitate conversation and give you some information to consider. So I think at this point in time, our forum part is finished. So what we'd like to do is wrap up. One of the things to know is that on the back of your sheet with the questions, there's a whole series of resources. And all of those texts are the ones that we relied on the most and that we found to be the most helpful or representative of the key arguments about hate speech. So if you want to explore more on your own, please do so. Some of them are available at the library. Some of them are books you could buy, and there are a lot of just interesting videos and informative sessions online on YouTube. So check those out.
I could speak to one of them.
Oh, sure.
I would strongly recommend that you listen to, if you have time, number 6, the video, sponsored by the National Constitution Center. It's a pro-con argument between Shannon Gilreath, as we mentioned, and David French of the National Review. And it's just really insightful to see those different perspectives developed by people much more articulate than Angela and I.
Can I just add something
Sure.
too? I know a lot of us were really interested in that balance between the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment, because it's not really a smackdown of should we censor. It has more to do with how do we support equality while at the same time maintaining freedom of speech. And that particular debate really goes in depth. It's wonderful. It's long, so don't be put off by it. It's worth your time.
Real quickly here, we're just going to show you a couple other texts that were pretty helpful to us. Anthony Lewis was a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He was a columnist for the New York Times. He died in 2013, but this book was extremely helpful in taking you back through the history of the arguments about the First Amendment. We mentioned Nadine Strossen, we mentioned Andrew Marantz. This was just from the New York Times, which you can find online, and it's also, it's also linked on that sheet there. We weren't able to get a PDF published on the library website, but if you just Google it, it'll come straight up. Shannon Gilraith is one of the participants in that debate that we told you about. Jonathan Haidt and his colleague, George Lukainoff, are all over YouTube right now giving talks about the concern of how this hate speech, free speech debate is playing out among young people. It's worth noting, if you're looking around the room, that we don't have a lot of young people here tonight, and I would report to you this was a very insightful book. There is some extreme differences between people who are, say, retired age and young people in college right now on this issue. So if you're curious to learn more about that, this is a great place to start. Two authors that we came across regularly are Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanchik, and they're both professors of law at University of Pittsburgh, and their book, Must We Defend Nazis and Understanding Words That Wound. I would say this is a bit more academic, so if you're not a fan of what I would call academic jargon, this one's a little bit harder to wade through. Okay, so coming up on the 28th, before I say this, you have received an evaluation form that we would really appreciate your feedback on. So if you can take a minute before you leave tonight and fill that out and give it to one of us, Dan Sokol over here will be by the door and he can collect them. We would really appreciate that. We're just trying to get a sense with the library of the kinds of folks that are coming to this forum and whether or not you found it helpful, to what degree. So next week, next Monday, is the second part in this series. We'll be exploring who benefits from hate speech and the role that technology plays in perpetuating this kind of political divide that we see in our country. So that should be really enlightening for you. Please mark November 18th. We're in that third part in our forum, we're going to be looking in much more detail about how we as individuals can respond and what are some of the successful approaches for overcoming impulsive judgments that eliminate the possibility for real communication and other proven strategies for supporting targets of hate speech. So we thank you very much for your time tonight. And
would you go back to that previous slide?
Sure.
Thanks.
You bet.
I don't write fast enough.
That's all right. Thank you for asking that. Dan, is there anything else you want to say before we leave?
I'm sure there's more information through the Port Vancouver Regional Library, including the flyer about all 3 dates. Sharon has next week, I've got the one on November 18th. Spread the word, bring in family, friends. As we approach our Thanksgiving dinners, we might look for more peaceful ways to engage our loved ones. So keep that in mind. And it'll be a great deal of audience engagement from the beginning through the end. So that way, that's Sharon and I, that's our way of making sure you're awake. And
What's
we
the
don't
start
lose
time
anything.
on these?
And
6
we
o'clock.
hope that you'll come out of it with some good ideas to build upon after tonight's great education.
And in case you didn't catch that, 6 o'clock, same starting time, same time slot. So, thank you for joining us tonight.